What if I told you the United States, after spending trillions on defense and projecting power across the globe for decades, is now negotiating from someone else's capital and not on its own terms? Right now, talks are happening in Islamabad, not Washington, not New York, and that alone is raising serious questions. Is this strategy or is this damage control? Because while the headlines say negotiations, the tone coming out of Washington sounds more like panic than power. And here's the bigger question. If America is winning, why does it look like it's scrambling? Tonight, we're breaking down what's really happening behind the scenes and why this moment could signal something much bigger than just another Middle East crisis. Number 1. Islamabad talks explained. Right now in 2026, one of the most important geopolitical developments is unfolding not in Washington, D.C., but in Islamabad, Pakistan. Direct, or at least near-direct, negotiations between the United States and Iran are taking place there, and that alone is a major signal of how unusual this moment really is. Representing the United States is Vice President J.D. Vance, stepping into a high-stakes diplomatic role, while Iran has sent senior leadership delegates from Tehran, signaling that they are taking these talks seriously but cautiously. Pakistan, hosting the discussions in its capital Islamabad, is acting as both mediator and facilitator, positioning itself as a critical regional player at a time when tensions could easily spiral out of control. The atmosphere surrounding these talks is intense. Islamabad has effectively become a high-security zone, with tight restrictions, heavy surveillance, and global media attention locked onto every movement. This isn't a routine diplomatic meeting. It's happening under the shadow of a fragile and uncertain ceasefire. According to multiple international reports, including coverage from major global news agencies, the region is still on edge after recent escalations tied to Iran, Israel, and broader Middle Eastern dynamics. That means every word spoken in those rooms carries weight, and every delay or disagreement could have immediate consequences far beyond Pakistan's borders. At the heart of these negotiations is a clear and growing tension. Washington is entering these talks with one primary objective: to restore leverage. After a series of events that many analysts believe expose limitations in U.S. strategic control, the priority now is to regain influence both diplomatically and politically. On the other side, Tehran is approaching the table with a very different mindset. Iran is not looking to concede under pressure. Instead, it is pushing for recognition of its terms that, according to analysts, have remained largely consistent over time. This creates a fundamental clash in expectations, where one side is trying to reassert dominance while the other is demanding acknowledgement. And that's what makes this moment so critical. These talks are not just about de-escalation, they're about positioning, perception, and power. So the question is not whether talks are happening. The real question is, who came to the table from a position of strength? Number 2. Why Islamabad matters. To really understand what's happening right now, you have to look beyond the headlines and focus on one critical detail: the location. These talks are not happening in Washington, D.C. They're not happening in Brussels, London, or any traditional Western power center. They are happening in Islamabad, Pakistan. And that is not just a logistical choice, it's a geopolitical signal. Because when the United States, a global superpower, is negotiating a high-stakes conflict from another country's capital, it tells you something has shifted beneath the surface. Think about it this way. Historically, major negotiations involving the U.S. tend to happen on its own turf or within its close diplomatic network, places where it sets the tone, controls the environment, and manages the narrative. But this time, that control looks different. Islamabad is not just a neutral venue, it represents a regional power stepping into a role that used to be dominated by Western capitals. And according to multiple international reports, Pakistan has positioned itself as a mediator that both sides are willing to engage with, which adds another layer of significance to this moment. Pakistan's role here is not accidental. Geographically and politically, it sits at the intersection of several critical regions. It connects South Asia to the Middle East, it has deep ties with Gulf countries, and it maintains strong strategic relationships with China. At the same time, it holds influence within the broader Muslim world. That combination makes Islamabad a unique bridge, one that can speak, at least partially, to both sides of this conflict, and that's exactly why it's hosting these talks. But beyond strategy, there's symbolism. Islamabad is not just the location, it is the message. It reflects a world where influence is no longer centralized in a few Western capitals. It suggests that regional powers are gaining confidence and stepping into roles that reshape how diplomacy is conducted. When a crisis this significant is being managed from Islamabad instead of Washington or Europe, it raises serious questions about who is really driving the process. And here's the deeper takeaway. When a superpower has to stabilize a crisis through another capital, that tells you the map of influence is shifting. Not collapsing, not disappearing, but changing. And in geopolitics, those changes don't happen overnight. They reveal themselves in moments exactly like this one.
Number 3. Trump under pressure. There's a clear contrast playing out right now between what we're hearing publicly from Donald Trump and what's actually happening behind the scenes, and that gap is where the real story begins. On one hand, Trump's public messaging has been aggressive, even maximalist. He's talking about pressure, dominance, and control, including strong rhetoric around securing or reopening critical global routes like the Strait of Hormuz. The tone is unmistakable. Strength, leverage, and zero compromise. But at the exact same time, the White House is actively engaged in negotiations in Islamabad, and that raises a critical question. If everything is under control, why is urgent diplomacy even necessary? Because the reality is, escalation comes with real costs. According to international financial coverage and global market reporting, even the hint of instability in the Gulf region has already started impacting oil prices, shipping risks, and investor confidence. Markets don't respond to speeches, they respond to risk. And right now, the risk is rising. That creates pressure not just abroad, but inside Washington as well. Economic uncertainty, rising energy concerns, and global supply chain fears all feed into the decision-making process, whether publicly acknowledged or not. Then there's the diplomatic strain. Allies are watching closely. European capitals, Middle Eastern governments, and Asian economic powers are all calculating what this crisis means for their own stability. When rhetoric escalates faster than strategy, it forces partners into uncomfortable positions, and that weakens coordination at a time when alignment is critical. Add to that the possibility of strategic overreach, where the U.S. pushes too far without securing a stable outcome, and you begin to see why negotiations are happening in parallel with tough talk. What makes this even more striking is the split between locations. Washington, D.C. remains the center of political messaging, the speeches, the statements, the projection of strength. But Islamabad has become the center of emergency diplomacy where the real work of de-escalation is taking place. Two different stages, two different tones, and potentially two very different realities. So here's the question worth asking. Does this look like confidence, or does it look like a leader trying to sound strong while events move faster than his strategy? Because in moments like this, the difference between perception and reality can define the outcome.
Number 4. The Henningsen perspective. To really understand the deeper meaning behind this moment, it helps to look at it through the lens of Patrick Henningsen's analysis. In his view, this is not a simple story of who won or lost on the battlefield. That's the surface-level narrative. The real story, according to Henningsen, is about something far more significant, the strategic exposure of U.S. weakness. Not weakness in the sense of lacking military power, but weakness in the ability to control outcomes, shape the narrative, and dictate the terms of resolution. Break it down into 3 simple ideas. First, the United States still has the ability to strike, militarily, economically, and politically. That hasn't changed, but what appears to have changed is its ability to impose a stable, long-term outcome after those actions. In other words, power can still be projected, but control over the aftermath is far less certain. That creates a gap between action and result, and that gap is where strategic credibility begins to erode. Second, Iran's position looks different when viewed through this lens. Instead of collapsing under pressure, Tehran has shown that it can absorb shocks and still remain in the game, politically and diplomatically. According to ongoing international analysis, Iran has maintained a consistent set of demands and has not significantly shifted its core negotiating position. That kind of consistency sends a signal. It suggests resilience, and it forces the opposing side to adapt rather than dominate. And third, and perhaps most importantly, the region is watching. Capitals across the Middle East and beyond, from Riyadh to Ankara to even parts of Europe, are closely observing how this plays out. What they are seeing is not just a conflict, but a demonstration of limits. The perception that the United States cannot easily dictate outcomes, even after applying pressure, changes how other nations calculate their own strategies moving forward. And this is where Henningsen's core idea becomes clear. You don't have to conquer Washington to damage its empire. Sometimes you just force it into contradiction, where strong rhetoric meets constrained reality, where pressure meets resistance, and where control is expected but not delivered. That contradiction doesn't just affect one negotiation, it reshapes how power itself is perceived on the global stage. Number 5. Power looks thinner. At the core of this entire situation is a much bigger question. Has this crisis exposed limits in U.S. power that weren't as visible before? To understand that, it helps to break it down into 3 simple pillars: military limits, diplomatic contradictions, and narrative collapse. These are not abstract ideas, they are playing out in real time across cities like Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Beirut. Start with military limits. The United States still has unmatched military capabilities, there's no question about that. It can strike targets, deploy assets, and project force across regions faster than almost any other country. But here's the key issue. Military power can destroy, but it doesn't always translate into control. What we're seeing now is that even with overwhelming force, shaping the political outcome afterward is far more complicated. Tehran, for example, has not folded under pressure. Instead, it continues to push its demands and remain part of the negotiation process. That alone challenges the idea that military superiority guarantees strategic success. Then comes diplomatic contradictions. In Washington, the official messaging is tough, assertive, and focused on strength. At the same time, negotiations are actively taking place in Islamabad. That creates a visible contradiction. Threats on one side, talks on the other. Diplomacy tends to weaken when those 2 tracks collide. Allies begin to question consistency, and adversaries begin to test boundaries. Meanwhile, Tel Aviv adds another layer of complexity. Any escalation linked to Israel shifts the dynamics, making it harder for the U.S. to present itself as a stabilizing force while also being seen as aligned with one side of the conflict. Finally, there's narrative collapse. This is where perception becomes just as important as reality. For years, the United States has relied not only on power, but on the perception of control over events, outcomes, and global direction. But when too many actors begin to notice a gap between what is being said and what is actually happening, that narrative starts to break down. Beirut is a perfect example of this spillover effect. Instability there shows that the crisis isn't contained and that the broader region is reacting in unpredictable ways. And once allies, rivals, and markets all start reading that weakness the same way, the damage becomes bigger than one war.
Number 6. Beirut changes everything. One of the biggest mistakes in understanding this situation is treating it as a simple U.S.-Iran issue. In reality, diplomacy with Iran does not happen in a vacuum, and that's where Lebanon, and specifically Beirut,
enters the picture in a very significant way. While negotiations are taking place in Islamabad, events on the ground in and around Lebanon continue to shape the outcome in ways that aren't always visible in official statements. According to ongoing international coverage, tensions linked to Israel and Lebanon remain active, with intermittent strikes and military activity keeping the region on edge. That instability doesn't just stay local, it feeds directly back into the negotiation process. Beirut matters because it exposes a fundamental truth. The ceasefire is incomplete. On paper, there may be pauses, de-escalation efforts, or diplomatic language suggesting progress. But on the ground, the reality is far more fragile. When military actions continue in nearby theaters, it sends a signal that whatever agreement exists is partial at best. It also raises doubts about how much control any single actor actually has over the broader situation. If the region is still active militarily, then the idea of a stable resolution becomes harder to believe. More importantly, Beirut reminds us that this crisis is regional, not bilateral. It's not just Washington versus Tehran. It involves Tel Aviv, Beirut, Gulf capitals, and even extends into how global powers interpret the situation. Each move in Lebanon, each strike, each escalation adds another layer of complexity. It forces negotiators in Islamabad to factor in variables that are constantly shifting. That makes the process less predictable and far more volatile. And this is where the deeper insight comes in. Every bomb outside the negotiation room changes the meaning of the negotiation inside the room, because diplomacy relies on a certain level of stability, or at least the expectation of it. When that stability doesn't exist, every agreement becomes conditional, every promise becomes uncertain, and every step forward risks being undone by events happening elsewhere. So Beirut is not a side story, it's a central piece of the puzzle. It turns what might look like a focused diplomatic effort into a layered geopolitical situation where multiple fronts are influencing a single outcome. And that makes everything more complicated, more fragile, and ultimately far more difficult to control.
Number 7. Oil and the Hormuz factor. If you really want to understand why this crisis matters beyond politics, you have to look at one place on the map: the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is one of the most critical NIFT choke points in the world, with a significant portion of global oil shipments passing through it every single day. That means any tension involving Iran, the United States, or regional actors immediately raises concerns about whether that flow could be disrupted. And right now, with negotiations happening in Islamabad, that risk is very much part of the conversation. According to ongoing international financial and energy reporting, even the possibility of instability around Hormuz has already started to ripple through global markets. Oil prices react quickly to uncertainty, and when traders see tension in that region, they don't wait, they adjust. That leads to increased fuel costs, and those costs don't stay confined to oil companies. They move through the entire system. Higher fuel prices affect transportation, which affects goods, which ultimately affects what people pay at the grocery store and beyond. At the same time, shipping companies become more cautious. Insurance premiums for vessels passing through the Gulf can rise, routes can be reconsidered, and delays can start to build. This creates a chain reaction, one that contributes to inflation pressure globally. For viewers here in the United States, that might show up as higher gas prices, more expensive imports, or increased strain on already tight household budgets. It's not just a geopolitical story, it's an economic one. And while talks are taking place in Islamabad, other capitals are watching very closely. Cities like Riyadh, Dubai, and Doha are deeply tied to the stability of energy markets. Their economies, exports, and long-term planning all depend on predictable flows through Hormuz. Any disruption, even temporary, can have major consequences for them, and by extension, for global markets.
This is where foreign policy stops being abstract and starts showing up in real life. It's not just about negotiations in distant cities or statements from political leaders. It's about energy bills, supply chains, and even retirement accounts that are tied to market performance. When Hormuz is at risk, the entire global system feels it. So while Islamabad may be the stage for diplomacy, Hormuz is where the real pressure is being applied. And in many ways, the markets are already casting their vote on how serious this situation really is.
Number 8. Europe is watching. While most of the attention is focused on Islamabad, Tehran, and Washington, there's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked, and that's how Europe is quietly reacting. Because the fallout from this crisis is not limited to the Middle East. It's already being felt in capitals across Europe, from Rome to Madrid, and even deeper into the political corridors of Brussels. And what's happening there may be just as important as what's happening at the negotiation table. In cities like Rome and Madrid, policymakers are looking at this situation through a different lens. For them, this isn't just about Iran or U.S. strategy. It's another reminder of how dependent Europe has been on Washington's ability to manage global crises. And when that management starts to look uncertain or inconsistent, it forces uncomfortable questions. According to international political analysis, there's growing concern in parts of Europe about whether relying too heavily on U.S. leadership is still a safe long-term strategy, especially when crises begin to spill over into economic and energy stability. Then there's Brussels, where the broader NATO conversation is unfolding. NATO has long been the backbone of Western security coordination, but moments like this expose underlying tensions. If Washington is sending mixed signals, projecting strength on one hand while urgently negotiating on the other, it can create strategic confusion among allies. Countries begin to wonder how aligned they really are and what their role should be if the situation escalates further. Energy vulnerability is another major factor. Europe has already experienced how fragile its energy situation can become during geopolitical disruptions. Any instability involving the Strait of Hormuz or the broader Middle East immediately raises concerns about supply, pricing, and long-term planning. That puts additional pressure on European governments to reassess their exposure and diversify their strategies, sometimes independently of Washington's approach. And this is where the bigger picture comes into focus. When the center of gravity moves, distant capitals start adjusting before the headlines catch up. Europe may not be at the center of this conflict, but it is deeply affected by its consequences. And as leaders in Rome, Madrid, and Brussels quietly recalibrate their positions, it signals something important, that the ripple effects of this crisis are global, and the assumptions that once held the Western alliance together are now being tested in real time.
Number 9. Negotiation or pause? At this point, the biggest question isn't just what's happening, it's what this all actually means. Are these talks in Islamabad designed to produce a real solution, or are they simply buying time before the next phase of conflict begins? Because when you step back and look at the full picture, from Washington to Tehran, from Tel Aviv to Beirut, the signals are mixed at best. On paper, this looks like diplomacy. You have negotiators, mediators, structured dialogue, and the language of de-escalation. But on the ground, the reality feels far less stable. Take Islamabad, where the talks are happening. It represents the effort to contain the situation, to slow things down, to prevent further escalation. But then look at Washington, where the messaging remains firm, even aggressive, signaling that pressure is still very much on the table. Shift to Tehran, and you see a different posture, one of resilience and insistence on long-standing demands. Then there's Tel Aviv, where ongoing tensions tied to Israel's actions continue to influence the regional dynamic. And finally, Beirut, where instability reminds everyone that the conflict is still active in very real ways. When you connect all these points, a pattern starts to emerge. This isn't a clean negotiation environment where both sides are moving steadily toward resolution.
Instead, it feels more like a pause, a moment where all sides are reassessing, repositioning, and preparing for what could come next. According to international analysis and diplomatic reporting, this kind of situation often leads to one of two outcomes. The first is a temporary de-escalation, where tensions ease just enough to stabilize markets and reduce immediate risks, but without addressing the deeper issues. The second is a short-lived truce, where the calm doesn't hold and confrontation returns, sometimes even more intense than before. And that's what makes this moment so uncertain, because while the structure of negotiation is there, the underlying momentum doesn't fully support it. Too many variables are still in play, too many actors are involved, too many unresolved tensions remain. The map says negotiation, the momentum says unresolved conflict.
Number 10, bigger than Trump. To close this out, it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture because, according to Patrick Henningsen's perspective, this moment is not really about Donald Trump alone. It's about something deeper, something structural. This crisis, in his view, is revealing cracks that go beyond one administration, one decision, or even one conflict. It's exposing a shift in how American power functions on the global stage. Trump may be the face of this moment, his tone, his messaging, his approach to pressure and negotiation, but the underlying issue is much broader. The real question is whether the United States can still dictate outcomes the way it once did. For decades, the assumption has been that when Washington makes a move, military, economic, or diplomatic, it can shape the result in its favor. But what we're seeing now challenges that assumption. From Tehran maintaining its position, to negotiations being held in Islamabad instead of Washington, to regional dynamics involving Tel Aviv and Beirut complicating the picture, the system doesn't look as controlled as it once did. According to ongoing global political analysis, this isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern where power is becoming more distributed, where regional actors are asserting themselves more confidently, and where traditional centers of influence are being tested. That doesn't mean the United States is no longer powerful. It clearly still is. But it does mean that power is no longer as automatic or as decisive as it once appeared. And this is where Henningsen's core insight really lands. His point is not just that Trump looks rattled under pressure, it's that the old machinery of empire no longer looks automatic. It no longer guarantees predictable outcomes. It no longer ensures that pressure will lead to compliance. Instead, it creates situations where contradictions emerge, where strength is projected, but results are uncertain. That shift matters, because once allies, rivals, and neutral observers all begin to see that change, it alters how they behave moving forward. They adjust their strategies, they test limits, they look for alternatives. So this isn't just about one crisis or one set of negotiations. It's about a moment where the system itself is being questioned and where the answers are still very much unfolding. At the end of the day, behind all the strategy and headlines, it's ordinary people from Washington to Beirut who carry the real cost of these decisions. And maybe that's the question we should all be asking ourselves tonight. Where is this really heading? Drop your thoughts below. I genuinely want to hear how you see this unfolding. And if you want a deeper breakdown of how we got here, check out my previous video on your screen. We put a lot of work into bringing you this kind of analysis, so if you value it, hit subscribe. It's just one click, but it keeps this channel going.